Tonight, on the brink. The world watches as the Russian military continues to build up along the border with Ukraine. And Russian President Vladimir Putin still making moves ahead of a potential invasion. And
I had no right to overturn the election.
The vice president's role in certifying election results, and why a bipartisan group of lawmakers today want to clarify the 19th century's Electoral Count Act. Plus,
frankly, the United States enabled this, and that's just most unfortunate, David.
Former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo blames the White House for the tinderbox in Eastern Europe. All this and more tonight on Faith Nation. From Moscow to Washington, D.C., a full-court diplomatic press to lower the temperature in Eastern Europe. Welcome to Faith Nation. I'm John Jessup. Well, will he or won't he? World leaders worry Russian leader Vladimir Putin could invade Ukraine at any moment. The White House now bracing for worst-case scenario should the Kremlin wage a full-scale war. CBN's Brody Carter is tracking the latest developments in tonight's top story. Brody, NATO allies are attempting to walk a high-wire, high-risk round of diplomacy here.
John, President Biden met with Germany's chancellor today, discussing ways they can work together to stop Russian aggression along Ukraine's border. This follows the weekend release of intelligence highlighting how a Russian invasion could potentially leave Ukraine in shambles. It also estimates that due to Vladimir Putin's number of troops assembled, that there could be some 50,000 civilian casualties and 5 million refugees if the invasion moves forward.
Germany is one of America's closest allies, working in lockstep to further deter Russian aggression in Europe and to address the challenges posed by China and to promote stability in the Western Balkans.
Today, key diplomatic meetings were held to work on that preparation as threats of war still linger. President Biden's meeting with Chancellor Olaf Scholz serves to bolster the two countries' commitment to de-escalate this crisis. One point of contention is the Russian-owned Nord Stream 2 pipeline project, which is becoming a key bargaining chip because it would bypass Ukraine and deliver gas directly to Germany. The president promised today they would pull the plug on the project if Russia invades Ukraine. Another important meeting in Moscow where French President Emmanuel Macron met with Vladimir Putin. While Macron says a deal to avoid full-scale war is possible, it would take multiple discussions for a resolution. Meanwhile, some 130,000 Russian forces are amassed along Ukraine's border. Over the weekend, Russia's defense ministry released a video of live fire exercises while moving naval resources to the Mediterranean. U.S. and European allies have warned for weeks a Russian invasion could be imminent, while Russian diplomats call those claims madness and scaremongering. Still, Ukrainian civilians are signing up as reservists and undergoing weapons and medical training as part of a worst-case scenario. One Russia expert says this crisis could turn into World War III.
War between Russia and the United States is inevitable. And so because of that worst-case scenario paranoid mindset, there's some probability that it might happen. So we are this close to a potential disaster.
If Russia chooses to invade Ukraine, the financial costs would be extremely high in the form of sanctions. Senate Republicans and Democrats are working together to create a robust package they believe could be devastating to Russia's economy. John, back to you.
All eyes still watching what's happening over there. Thank you, CBN's Brody Carter. Well, the tinderbox in Eastern Europe coincides with discussions over Iran's nuclear program. Those talks set to resume tomorrow in Vienna. President Biden and Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett spoke Sunday just as the U.S.-Iran nuclear talks enter crunch time over a possible deal. It was the first conversation between the two in over 3 months. Israel maintains that an agreement could damage its ability to deal with Tehran's nuclear program, which the Jewish state contends is not for peaceful purposes. Well, joining us now is Behnam Bentaleblu, Senior Fellow with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Behnam, nice to see you this evening. The Israeli Prime Minister described the Iran nuclear deal in the works as, quote, damaging, adding that, quote, whoever thinks an agreement will increase stability is wrong. Care to weigh in here, Behnam?
Sure, and it's a pleasure to be back with you. In essence, a deal that I and many others called fatally flawed in 2015 to deal with the kind of known nuclear infrastructure the Islamic Republic had in place then will not at all meet the non-proliferation or other security requirements the international community, not just Israel and the U.S., have, of course. That is at stake here. Something that was flawed then, when we knew less about Iran's program, is actually going to be devastating today if Washington once again trades away sanctions relief in a bid to resurrect this agreement. So I'm inclined to agree with the Prime Minister there.
Behnam, U.S. officials are warning there are only a few weeks left to salvage that 2015 Iran nuclear deal. Interestingly enough, it had all different international parties coming together, from Russia, who's considered our nemesis, to France and Britain. What's the Biden administration's incentive here, and why the rush to get it done?
So I think the Biden administration is rushing and building this case for an urgent need for a deal off of a year of premature concessions, which you saw through indirect sanctions relief, lack of enforced sanctions, turning a blind eye to illicit Iranian oil exports throughout 2021, as well as having no clear plan to push back on the Islamic Republic in the Middle East, simply because the administration wants something of a cap, something of a period for a freeze on the Iranian nuclear program, so that it can actually pivot and build on, I would say, the past decade of U.S. political discourse of wanting to get out of the Middle East. But it seems like they're unaware that the Islamic Republic is not only looking to get America out, but to become the hegemon to fill the void, which may, in fact, create the groundwork for war that may drive the U.S. back in.
Are you concerned that there might be even more concessions?
Oh, for sure. I think the late Friday news dump that everyone got that entailed the civilian nuclear sanctions waivers that the Biden administration gave is a sign of really this escalating round of premature concessions that the administration is giving, signaling to Tehran that it is politically very eager to resurrect this nuclear deal.
All right, Behnam Bentaleblu with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Behnam, thank you for being with us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Well, as the country looks to the looming midterms this fall, a small bipartisan group of lawmakers is looking back to reform the Electoral Count Act. With a standalone bill separate from the Democrats' push to advance voting rights, some believe it's the key to last year's Capitol attack. CBN's Caitlin Burke explains.
In short, the Electoral Count Act lays out how Congress should count electoral college votes from each state, especially when there's a dispute. That happened in the 1876 presidential election.
There were a lot of allegations of fraud in that election. 4 states ended up sending 2 different slates of electors to Congress.
A decade later, the Electoral Count Act established a joint session of Congress to oversee the counting of electoral votes. During that process, any written objection to the votes from at least 1 House member and 1 senator sends lawmakers back to their respective houses to consider the objection. The power to sustain or overrule it is placed fully with Congress. That played out after the 2020 election. The law is back in the spotlight because former President Donald Trump and others insist Vice President Mike Pence had the power to throw out certain election results.
They were hoping that there would be objections made under the act by a member of the House and a member of the Senate to the electoral votes coming from particular states, places like Georgia and Arizona, and then there would be a debate about whether they should be sustained or overruled. They were all overruled. And so the vice president did not have the power to then somehow change what the Senate had decided, what the House had decided. I think there were folks hoping he would do that, but he just didn't have the power to do it, neither under the statute nor under the Constitution.
Hans von Spakovsky, an election integrity expert with the Heritage Foundation, says the vice president's role in certifying election results is purely ministerial, which means he really doesn't have any power at all, a point Pence himself recently addressed.
I had no right to overturn the election. The presidency belongs to the American people and the American people alone. And frankly, there is no idea more un-American than the notion that any one person could choose the American president.
While Spakowski sees 2020 as an example of the Electoral Count Act working, a bipartisan group of lawmakers feel the law needs to be clarified.
We saw on January 6th of 2021 how ambiguities in the law were exploited. We need to prevent that from happening again.
What really caused the insurrection? They thought there was a kind of ambiguity, if you will, and there was an avenue they could go through and maybe overturn the election, because it was not clear. And when one congressman and one senator can bring a state's authentic count to a halt, it's wrong.
Senator Manchin says he's confident a bill reforming the Electoral Count Act will pass. Spakowski disagrees, saying an amendment would not have prevented what happened on January 6th.
Many of the people who were protesting would have been unhappy about anything that happened, any process, unless President Trump was declared the winner of the election.
Meanwhile, some Democrats worry that a focus on just the Electoral Count Act could reduce urgency to pass through some larger voting rights bills. And Republicans worry Democrats could try and use the process to work in some of the measures they haven't been able to get through Congress. Caitlin Burke, CBN News.
All right, thank you, Caitlin. Here now, Julia Manchester, political reporter for The Hill. Julia, thanks for being here on Faith Nation tonight. The New York Times editorial board this weekend called January 6th a warning and said, asked this question: will lawmakers do anything to protect the 2024 election, adding that the 135-year-old Electoral Count Act needs fixing. Former President Trump, for his part, says the bipartisan drive to update the law somehow, or in essence, proves his stance that then Vice President Pence could have helped to overturn the 2020 election. That puts him at odds with the expert in Caitlin's package. Julia, at a time of such political rancor and polarization, is it possible we could actually see this effort pass? And if so, why this bill?
You know, I think it is possible. And this bill and the modifications to the bill that you're seeing, the strengthening of the bill, is really a formality, but it's sending a message, I think, to the American people and maybe to those figures, particularly President Trump or his allies that would be pushing to challenge the election, future election results or the last election results, that the system is still strong. So they are very much sending a message in opposition to former President Trump and really what he has been advocating for.
Former Vice President Mike Pence on Friday said he had no right to overturn the election, as we heard in Caitlin's piece. Pence is, though, seen as a potential 2024 Republican presidential candidate. Julia, how do you think that stance will go over with the GOP base, given their support of former President Trump and that they overwhelmingly agree with his claims of a rigged election?
You know, it's unclear because we've seen that a number of the campaign stops former Vice President Pence has made over the past year in important states, swing states, or first states, I should say, early voting states like New Hampshire. He's been very warmly received by the Republican grassroots base there. And you're seeing that he is getting crowds of people come to see him. I've covered a number of these events as well, and it seems like he is relatively popular with the conservative grassroots. That being said, I think there are questions, like you said, John, as to what this pushback against President Trump will mean. But I think there's also questions as to the influence President Trump has within the party. Look, his influence has certainly waned since he left office. So, we'll have to see when it comes to whether President Trump runs or not in 2024, how this will go over. But I think there's also a question not only about how Vice President Pence is received, but, the state of President Trump's influence within the party.
We only have about 30 seconds left. Talk about how this will all play out in dividing the Republican Party heading into the midterms.
Yeah, I think you're going to see Democrats in particular capitalize on that divide, accuse some Republicans running of being tied to January 6th. They're tied to President Trump's unfounded claims of election fraud. So you're definitely going to see that. And you're going to see President Trump wanting to reward candidates who go along with what he says on the campaign trail.
All right, Julia Manchester with The Hill, thank you as always.
Thank you.
Coming up, America's most recent chief diplomat weighs in on the crisis over Ukraine and warns how the tinderbox conflict is not contained only to Eastern Europe. And welcome back. The first wave of American troops landed in Poland Sunday, part of President Biden's military deployment in the wake of the crisis in Ukraine. Still, many are asking if it's in the country's best interest to get involved. One American who believes the United States should is former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who also says the president's weak foreign policy is enabling Vladimir Putin. David Brody has the story.
At this point, the biggest question remains, will President Vladimir Putin invade Ukraine?
No one knows the answer to that question. He may not even know at this point. He's racking and stacking. He's performing pretty elegant, rational math for himself to say, I want to have more political influence, more control in my near abroad. He feels still that the Soviet Union was a great thing, and he wants to restore as much of it as he can.
Is there a moral obligation to stop him?
So America's always had a strong belief that we wanted to support other democracies. Part of it's moral, part of it's our understanding of human dignity and the value of every human life, David. But part of it's just plain old importance to American national security. They are twin pillars.
And another pillar is the American economy, something Pompeo believes could be directly affected.
Almost a third of the wheat, red winter wheat that travels across the world, comes out of Ukraine and Russia and goes through the Black Sea, the very thing that is being threatened by Vladimir Putin. These things matter to the global food supply. If you're living in the outskirts of Las Vegas or Bakersfield or in Tennessee or Georgia or in the upper Midwest, you depend on these stable food supplies.
The former Secretary of State and CIA director believes it is the Biden administration that helped create this mess in Eastern Europe.
The United States enabled this, and that's just most unfortunate, David.
When you say enable that, explain exactly what you mean.
There's so many pieces to this. Deterrence is about mindset. It's about convincing your adversaries that you are serious and determined. And so, President Biden goes to meet with Vladimir Putin to talk about the fact that he shut down an American pipeline for gasoline in our country and says, don't do that again. No other costs imposed.
There's a lot of folks in America, tens of millions, that have no trust in Biden whatsoever, that he's going to bungle this one, too.
So I pray that they get it right. I want good things for them. This isn't about R's and D's. This is about America. I hope they get it right.
China's watching this, and do you believe they're seeing weakness from the Biden administration on this?
Well, of course they are. The whole world can observe that weakness. Yeah, Xi Jinping's doing his math too, not just with respect to Taiwan, with respect to running spies inside the United States.
If Trump, by the way, was president, would Putin dare even try any of this?
I can only say as a faithful Christian, I can only say I don't know, but I can tell you that he didn't.
Despite tough words on Biden's handling of Putin in Russia, he does like the decision to go after ISIS's top leader.
The world is safer as a result of him no longer being part of it. So congratulations to the Biden team for getting that done. It's not the end. The threat from radical Islamic terrorism remains, but it's always good when you can, in a way that we did, reach out, take down leadership of these terror networks. You make more difficult for them to bring that terror to our homeland.
David Brody, CBN News, Washington.
Up next, the international uproar after a human rights organization labels Israel an apartheid state. When Faith Nation returns. Supporters of Israel are blasting a report from Amnesty International that describes the Jewish nation as an apartheid state. Israelis have denounced charges of oppressing Palestinians as false and claim the report questions Israel's right to exist. Chris Mitchell reports.
Israel is rejecting what it calls false allegations in the Amnesty report.
Instead of seeking the truth, Amnesty echoes the same lies shared by terrorist organizations. 5 minutes of serious examination would be enough to know that the so-called facts in the report published by Amnesty this week are delusional and disconnected from reality.
Israeli Foreign Minister Yair Lapid charging that Amnesty doesn't call Syria, Iran, or other corrupt and murderous regimes apartheid states.
I hate to use the argument that if Israel wasn't a Jewish state, no one at Amnesty would dare make such a claim against it. But in this case, there's simply no other explanation.
The report is entitled Israel's Apartheid Against Palestinians, Cruel System of Domination and Crime Against Humanity. Amnesty's executive summary says Israel has established and maintained an institutionalized regime of oppression and domination of the Palestinian population for the benefit of Jewish Israelis, wherever it has exercised control over Palestinian lives since 1948. A Wall Street Journal editorial calls it, quote, a libel that distorts history. Israel was founded in the wake of the Holocaust with broad international support. The report is a denunciation of the very existence of Israel as a refuge for the Jewish people. Amnesty International says it's using the international definition of apartheid. But apartheid typically refers to the system of racial separation that gave white superiority over blacks in South Africa until the early 1990s. Israeli attorney Ian Hertzberg from the NGO Monitor says the report is aimed at questioning the legitimacy of Israel's existence.
The charge is powerful because it is an easy way to essentialize and exploit anti-Semitic tropes to transform the conflict into one of disputed lands and Arab rejection of Jewish presence in the Middle East to one of Jewish racism.
Israeli attorney David Benjamin grew up in South Africa. He says there's no comparison.
I was certainly a witness to the iniquities of that terrible system. And let me be absolutely clear, I've been living in Israel for the last 30-odd years, and there is absolutely nothing in common between the system of apartheid that applied in the old South Africa and the current situation in Israel.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Still ahead, a heartwarming story about a young girl without a date to the daddy-daughter dance who stepped in with a grand gesture for an unforgettable evening. And finally tonight, a fairy tale moment for a young football fan after a tragic year of loss. 11-year-old Audrey Soap lost both her father and grandfather in 2021. So when this year's father-daughter dance rolled around, Audrey's mom had an idea. She reached out to Audrey's favorite football player, Philadelphia Eagles safety Anthony Harris, whose response went above and beyond.
I just asked if he would come, if he'd be willing to come. And he said, not only will I come, I want to make sure she feels like a princess.
Harris didn't just fly into Texas for the dance. He also paid for the middle schoolers' dress, shoes, hair, and makeup. And as you can see there, posed for a lot of pictures. While the Eagles didn't take to the field last weekend, Audrey's family is taking it as a win. I'm sure a night she will never forget. Good on Mr. Harris as well. Thank you so much for watching. We hope to see you right back here tomorrow.